Namaste, good evening. Welcome to day two of Utkal Hacks 3.0. Boy, what an exciting first day we had. Loads of Patreons, loads of newbies, and it was a perfect kickoff, perfect way to start the hackathon. To summarize, we had Mr. Tadit Das explaining the philosophy of Utkal Hacks, the hordes of pros offline hackathons bring to the table, and how the result of this hackathon shouldn't decide how far your project should go. We then had Mr. Darshan Gajraj, who walked us through his journey from being a game enthusiast to a product designer. He helped us get multiple insights into different career choices. We then had Mr. Johan Eliasson, our sponsor and the founder CEO of nHost, who allowed us to take a walk through the journey of transforming front-end developers into full-stack engineers using nHost. We are now into the day two of Utkal Hacks 3.0, and we promised this to be as exciting as it was yesterday. So to start up, we have Michael Rittering. Michael here is a design advisor at Shift Nudge, and his side project, Figma Academy, is an entirely new way to learn product design. We had an opportunity to take a quick peek into Michael's talk, and boy, did we get bamboozled. So an exuberant and thrilling talk awaits you all. We won't mind if you drool throughout the talk as we did. Michael, over to you.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to go through this talk with you guys. The title of it is Using Figma Like an Engineer. And really what I mean by that is I'm going to walk through some of the practical ways and also the importance of having the same mental models between design and engineering, and also just creating a design language that you can use to power your product, and just how that makes it much more efficient and ultimately will end up creating a much better outcome. So let's dive in. I'm going to share my screen real quickly. Okay, cool. So I appreciate the intro. Yeah, Michael Rittering. Most people just call me Rid, and I am the creator of Figma Academy, design advisor for Shift Nudge, where I mentor a ton of designers. And also I work on building education products as well. And we're actually going to go through a couple of them as examples. And yeah, I love to help. And so in general, if you ever have design advice, questions, anything like that, ping me on Twitter and we can connect there. All right. So a quick overview here of what we're going to be talking about. Really, the purpose of this talk is to learn how to build products more efficiently by creating a shared language between design and engineering. And practically speaking, we're going to be doing that through components. Quick outline of where we're going to be heading. We're going to start by actually talking through atomic design. And I know a lot of people are probably familiar with that by now, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but atomic design is definitely going to power some of the foundational principles that we're going to use throughout this talk. And then we're going to get into how to create parity between design and engineering. And that can happen at the component level. We're going to show some ways to do that. And it can happen at the layout level and even at the organizational level as well. And then we're going to talk through some library systems and how we can set the entire organization up for success and to really start using components efficiently. And then last thing is we're going to we're going to look through some template components and how that can help us really just speed up the time that we're taking on building product. And I'm going to kind of illustrate that by just jumping into one of my Figma files, and we'll look at some like really practical actual design implementations and how we're thinking about library imports and component architecture and all of that. So let's get started. Okay, we're going to talk about atomic design first to kind of just honestly create the language for this entire conversation. And a quick overview for those who are not familiar, atomic design was actually created in a book by a gentleman named Brad Frost. And I think he's actually one of the more inspiring thought leaders when it comes to specifically front end code and design systems and product design in general. And the high level idea is that we're going to boil our products down to these fundamental components. And really, you can almost think of them as Legos. And in creating a shared Lego box for our product, we're able to assemble these pieces in a way that helps us build more efficiently and also minimizes sources of truth and makes it very easy for us to create updates that ripple throughout our entire organization. So the first thing is atoms, and these are the most basic functional UI elements, meaning they can't be broken down any further, which means most of the time, these are going to be your basic HTML elements as well. So you'll have like a button and inputs and icons. And from there, we have molecules, which are essentially just going to be combinations of atoms. And so, for example, here, we could take two inputs and a button, and that would create the basic content of a form. And if we take that form and combine it with a typography component and maybe a little checkbox, throw it into a container, now we are working with organisms, which are larger, more complex components like this full auth modal over here. And the importance of thinking this way is that it makes it so that we can just build more efficiently. We're not creating this auth modal from scratch. We are simply assembling it by using these Legos that we've already built. And everything is standardized between design and code because a button is a button is a button, you know? And that way, if we make any updates to our like fundamental atoms, these Lego blocks, they will automatically ripple throughout our entire product file. All everywhere that a button is will be updated, kind of thing. So it's that level of standardization that is going to really help and set us up for success for some of the methods that we're going to talk about later in this presentation. The next level up from organisms is going to be our templates. And essentially, you can think of a template as a page blueprint. In this example, I'm looking at a full onboarding screen here, which could be as simple as just combining our auth modal with some kind of an image to the right. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because there's a whole section of this talk dedicated to how to use template components in Figma. But this way, we at least kind of have an idea of what we're hoping to accomplish with atomic design and kind of why that's going to set us up for success. The last thing, and really kind of the starting point of any project, is going to be your design tokens. And this is essentially synonymous with variables. And it very literally contributes to our language between design and development, because these are all of our layer styles in Figma, and they most certainly are going to relate to like a theme file in our actual code where we will define all of our primary like brand color. Maybe this will be an object in code, and then we'll have like an interface palette, and that will be an object in code. We'll have typography components, paragraph components. I literally like to define spacing values, and that way, if a developer is coming into my file, they're never looking at specific numbers, really. We just start thinking in terms of variables. They don't see 16 pixels. You just think, oh, that's medium spacing. And if we do want to make those changes, that way they're all tied back to a single variable, and we can just kind of create these knobs that we can turn at the theme level in the source of our project. So Once we have all of that set up, we're really ready to start building out um, the Legos that we're going to use to assemble our projects, and that's going to have a ton of benefits that we'll talk about. One of the main things, though, is man, it makes it fast to prototype when you already have all of these pre-built components. Okay, and then some of these benefits here, I included a picture of these little Russian dolls because honestly, that's kind of what atomic design represents. You take the absolute smallest indivisible piece of UI and stack it inside of a molecule, stacked inside of an organism, stacked inside of these page templates. And that way, if you're making an update at the smallest level of the design system, those updates are reflecting everywhere. So you get maximum reusability. Um, you don't have to create elements from scratch each time. You already have your modal component and it is dynamic and you can swap in and out different inputs and buttons. It minimizes sources of truth as well. If a developer and a designer are looking at a Figma file and they see a button, they don't have to guess what that button represents or what the padding is on the right side or something like that. You just know that that button is tied back to your this original component, which is the same in code as it is in Figma. And then it also it creates this shared language. And I'll talk about this more in a little bit, but it actually is extremely helpful to have the same verbiage to be able to communicate with engineering and know that when I talk about this modal, I don't have to describe all of the details and what constitutes this modal. We have already decided that a modal has, maybe 64 pixels padding and it uses an H2 at the top with a subtext and then maybe some dynamic content. Um, and ultimately, especially in a world where most of us are building products remotely, the better that we can create this language and the more effectively we can communicate with each other, that is going to translate so directly into how well and how efficiently we're building these products. Um, and it's not even about creating components just to enhance our design workflow. I mean, components in many ways are the bridge between design and engineering. They are the things that we can standardize, the things that we can nail down consistent naming for to be able to talk about. And that's really what I mean when I say, working through creating a consistent design language. Okay. So now that we kind of have some of the fundamentals of atomic design and how we're thinking about components being derived from each other, we can talk about different ways to create parity between design and code. And it doesn't matter how many times you stare at these slides, there always will be a spelling error. Okay, so the first way that we're going to think about parity between design and code is at the component level. And the way I think that the necessary first step in order to do that is every single thing that you build has to be using the box model. And I know for engineers, obviously, that's so second nature that everything, of course, everything's in a box. But a lot of designers don't have the technical understanding of even how like CSS works and what is Flexbox and how does that what's the point really of using that in my designs. And I think something that I want to encourage more developers to do is to just sit down and like kind of teach designers how to think about this box model if they're not already, if they're not putting things in auto layout and using frames for you. That's a very real tangible way that you can improve the communication and speed up the time that it takes to crank out these different concepts and prototypes. So obviously right here, you can see how we're thinking about everything in here being this box. And one of the ways that is really becoming more possible in Figma is, we're relying on auto layout so much more in our designs. And for those of you who are not familiar, I'm not going to go into a full auto layout tutorial. There's a wonderful playground in the Figma community if you just search for auto layout, and it's an official Figma file, and it'll kind of show you how it works. But essentially, it is, especially with the most recent updates, auto layout has basically become Flexbox for designers. And so all you have to do is just hit Shift A, and it turns it into a Flexbox and essentially a div. And you don't actually have to use the word div. And maybe a designer would have no idea that they're actually doing Flexbox. But by using auto layout, you are essentially forcing yourself to construct UIs in a way that matches perfectly with Flexbox, and it's going to make it so much easier for developers to come in and understand how a design is fundamentally built. And that's this menu over here where you get to say, okay, is this packed, something like flex start, or is it space between? And what's the padding? And when you have all of these different nested auto layouts, what actually is happening is you're creating the HTML structure for a given UI. Even if a designer has no idea what this syntax is, it doesn't really matter anymore. And that is why I am a big proponent of naming your layers. And I know people freak out and they're like, what is the point? I'm totally fine with it saying frame 1241. And I get it. I really do. But naming your layers can become so second nature where you don't even think about it. Like I've just forced myself to develop this muscle memory of I hit Shift A to create an auto layout. And then as soon as I do, my fingers are immediately hitting Command R, and you just start typing a name. And it doesn't have to be these uh, strenuous names that are so specific. When I'm not naming like an actual component, which in that case, I would like to use the same component name that's like in Storybook, in a React code base or something like that. If it's just the inside contents of my this card component or something like that, just stay generic. Call it card, content, row, column, those kinds of things. It's going to make it so much easier for people to come into your Figma files, have any clue what's going on. And I actually think it makes it easier in the long run for us as designers to be able to figure out, like dissect our file if we want to make changes. And so I highly, highly recommend Command plus R being like a fundamental piece of your Figma workflow. Okay. The other way to think about creating parity with code is variance. And I mean, this is such a powerful feature that Figma has released. And yeah, on one hand, you that side menu where it does make things a little bit more fun and a little bit more efficient for just designers. But variance, more important than that, makes it really, really easy for us to communicate all of the possible states to developers and to think through all of these edge cases and to very easily document them, essentially. And so this is equally as important as the structure of the individual component is thinking through, okay, what are the different states that we have available here? And I want to give, this is almost like a mini little tutorial within this presentation, but there is an ideal way to construct variants, I think, and that is using base components. The reason that we label it base with this period in front is anything that starts with a period or an underscore in Figma doesn't get exported as our libraries. So it's not going to clutter our imported libraries basically in our files. And so this example is from a platform called Bootcamp, which we're going to look at more in a little bit. It's actually a project that I've worked on for the last year now. And you can see you have this practice test card. And these are our variants here where we have the different states. We have this default state. We have a state where you haven't actually attempted the test yet. We have a state where it is expanded, And then we have a state when the content is locked in like a freemium model as well. And the way that I built these, if we exit presentation mode here, the way that I built these is actually pretty important. So you can see our four things here, and that's gonna drive me crazy. Locked. Okay, within each variant, you can see we have these components here, which is base. And I'm not gonna lie, I accidentally messed these ones up. But the important thing is within within each of these, we're pulling from this base component here. And the base component is the most complex version of what this can be. It can include everything. So in this case, we have the results, we have our primary content, and we have this bottom row here. And what we do when we construct these variants is we actually duplicate the base component. And the reason being is that way, we're going to automatically preserve all of our overrides when we make changes. And we also have a single source of truth. So if I were to change something on this base component, it's going to reflect everywhere. Where if we would have created these components individually, the issue is that you have to say you want to change the padding. You have to change the padding on every single one, which maybe isn't a terrible deal when we have kind of a simple map of variants with only 4 instances here. But if we're dealing with a button with potentially hundreds of different versions or an input or something like that, it's really, really, really important to adopt this workflow of create a base component, name it with a period in front, duplicate that, and use that as the foundation for your variants. And that way, everything is tied back to this single source of truth. You get all the benefits of variants without having to create more manual work for yourself. So that is one way that we can um, really drive parity and as designers communicate all of the intended states to developers is really leaning into these variants. So kind of in summary of this idea of creating parity at the component level is one, it makes it way easier to communicate. Not only the different states, but how we're really, really thinking about each component. Like, is this width fixed? Is the width does it automatically fill the whole container? All of those auto layout controls can they communicate so much to engineering. And if you really get on the same page where the assumption is, hey, I as a developer expect you as a designer to build your UI in Figma the way that I can build it in code. It starts to create these Figma files that function much more as blueprints and not just as pictures. It's not like, hey, make it look like this. It's actually, hey, my layer list is how I am thinking about this product from an HTML level and exactly how many divs I'm including and at what levels and how do they behave? How are they responsive? That kind of stuff is really important, and it's going to make things so much easier for developers than building something and then you come back later and you say, oh well, at this breakpoint actually it responds like this, and then you're looking at the CSS as a developer and you're like, well, I mean, I don't have the right amount of divs or something like that. It eliminates all of that confusion, and it forces designers to really think through their UI. And then the second thing is, man, you can build a lot more quickly. When everyone's on the same page and when you're really getting into a groove with auto layout, you are flying as a designer. And so I'm at the point now where, and again, I don't want to come across as like, this is the way, you have to do it this way. But you might find it eye-opening because I'm still not sure how many designers are thinking like this. For my pages, like if you were going to look at a really full page of a bunch of different UI mockups, you're going to struggle to find anything that's not in an auto layout. I mean, I auto layout everything, and it's because that's how That's how UI is ultimately going to be built on the front end. And you get all of those benefits. Everything is standardized. You're using all of your, those spacing values that we looked at in the tokens. You can automatically bake those into your auto layout components. And it's just going to make everything a lot easier. Okay, let's keep moving. I don't want to run out of time here. Okay. The third thing we're going to look at is creating parity within your library systems. And when I'm referring to libraries, I'm talking about this window here, where if you hit assets, publish, and you can select from all of the different libraries that you have available, and then you can obviously publish this file as a library so that you can import those components into other files. Really, when it comes down to it, libraries are just a way to transfer components and tokens from file to file. And if you think about it, like, there's a lot of opportunity to create parity at the organizational level, because how's a code base going to work, right? Like, you're going to have your source file where you have these, maybe it's like a theme file, or like your atoms, like a button or an input, that are imported everywhere. But then maybe you're going to have more specific pages and components that are specific to like a page. And obviously those aren't going to be at the source level. That's going to be at that page level. And so in the same way that developers think through the architecture of their code base and all of their import statements, designers have to do the same thing. And so it makes sense to do it together and to figure out what the mental map of a product is. And so that's something that I do on all of my major products, is I will literally create a map. And so we're going to look at one right here. And I want to preface this by saying yours doesn't have to look exactly like this. There's not necessarily like one right way. I hope that this is a little bit eye-opening, though, for how this can work in Figma and how you can think through the different flowcharts of import statements in the same way that I guarantee you're already thinking about as developers. And I just want to illustrate how similar it can be in Figma as well. So let's hop into this file here. And this is for bootcamp.com, which is, I've led design on that project for the last year. And the way that this works, and you can see I have a wall of text here that I'm not going to read, but the way that this works is we have different tiers of our product. And I really want to stress how those tiers relate to a code base. At the very top level, you have the design system. And what's included in the design system is going to be our most, like I call it a UI kit, but really it's really going to be mostly atoms, like those smallest level Lego pieces that we use to power all of our other larger components. We need those at the highest level in our organization because they're used everywhere. In the same way, maybe we have like icons, but that style guide is where all of our tokens live. So within a Figma organization, I'm going to have a style guide, and it's going to include everything that would be in like a theme.js file. So you'll have like your brand palette, which will be a color object in code, neutrals palette, which will be an object in code. I have an interface palette. I have different kinds of shadows and opacities and blur effects, all of the layer styles in Figma. I want to make sure that there is a matching variable that literally uses the same name as an object at the theme root level of my project. And that way I have the same language to use with developers. And when they see a layer style in Figma, they know that they can use that exact same thing within the theme file. And same kind of thing, text styles, these are all going to be typography components, and you might define them at different breakpoints and whatnot. Okay, so looking back at this map, hopefully that makes sense. This is your top level of the organization, everything that powers the rest of these files. So for our purposes, I'm actually going to hide the Webflow and just focus on these platform projects to make it a little bit more concise. Within the bootcamp.com framework, which, just for quick context sake, it's a framework that powers online learning platforms for pre-med students, like chemistry or graduate level anatomy, or maybe you're studying for the OAT or the DAT or something like that. So the project itself, I've broken up into these 6 large buckets of pages and screens. And within each of these pages, I'm going to import my design system files as libraries, which I documented here. And that way I have access to all my colors, all my buttons, all my spacing values. So if we jump into, actually, let's look at QBanks, which is just like the testing experience. If we jump into this file, you'll see that, yeah, we have the, maybe I'll go somewhere else. Okay, we're good. You'll see we have the libraries imported. So within here, I'm bringing in my UI kit, my icon library, my style and brand guide. And that way I have access to all of my atoms. But there are going to be some components within the question bank experience that are specific to these pages. And so I don't want those to live in my UI kit because they're not getting, well, I guess this is the UI kit here. They're not getting imported everywhere. These components are specific to your core pages. And that makes sense, right? Like you'll probably have a root level components folder in code, and then you'll have a components folder within whatever page you're working on as well. And so it can work exactly the same in Figma so that everyone's on the same page. So here are all of my screens, but more importantly, I have these components that I'm using, which, they might be these different modals here and sidebar components and all of the different states that my sidebars can take, and timers and stuff like that. So that is what an individual file is going to look like. It's going to have the screens, but then the components that are powering those screens. And if we head back here, all of those files are going to work the same way. So you have one design system project that has a bunch of top level libraries imported everywhere. Then you have your individual pages. Within those individual pages, you have component libraries specific to those pages. And then I want to stress the importance of having separation between the screens that are ready for production and screens that you're actively exploring and throwing paint at the wall with and shaping ideas. And so I like to think of those as shaping playgrounds. Now, the nice thing is we have components in each of these core files here. And so if we publish something like core pages or QBanks as a library, then at any time I can import those components from QBanks and put it into a shaping file. And that way I have the most up-to-date version of all of my components and layouts that I can detach, play around with, mess around with. And then once maybe we release a new feature that I feel pretty good about the design, I'll take those new components and I'll move them into the QBanks file or the auth onboarding file or something like that. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't want to spend too much time on this. And I want to make sure there's time for questions if you guys want to talk more about this. But if we head back here, kind of just summarizing the benefits of libraries. One is it just makes it way easier to find things, not only in Figma, but in code as well, because it's all about creating this, again, this shared language. How can we make it very, very easy for designers and developers to talk about our product? And one of the ways is by having the way that the Figma organization is set up match the way that the code base is set up, where we're breaking things out into similar libraries or folders, and we're importing different places that it just all makes sense. And that way it's much easier for a developer to jump into Figma and kind of find where things at and be using that same mental model to evaluate the UI. And then obviously, you'll see pretty much every benefit slide is going to say something about standardization, because that is a really important piece of making a high quality product, is just creating familiarity with the user. And it's better UI UX, And it's also way the heck easier to build when you're using these Legos and layouts that are already pre-built. And then the last thing is just knowing what's up to date. It's not always easy to pop into a Figma file and know like, what's actually ready to be built versus what is more exploratory. And having that separation between essentially like production and staging within Figma as well is really helpful, because if a developer pops into like my Cubanks file here, they know that everything in these pages is ready to go. And all of these components are the most up-to-date things. Everything that is not up to date is just in those separate shaping projects. All right. The last big idea is using templates to design more efficiently. And a reminder of what templates are, it's this principle from Atomic Design where essentially it is a page blueprint. And a lot of times, I think incorrectly, components are associated with making things rigid to the point where it actually slows down design and it slows down development. And honestly, I just think that couldn't be further from the truth, because what we're doing with templates is just eliminating a ton of manual work by minimizing our sources of truth. And I'll show you what that means, because how many design files look something like this? Like, this is a mobile app prototype that I created last year. And I mean, it's beastly, right? Like, heaven forbid you make a change to the tab bar or the way that the search icon works, and you have to update it everywhere. So what templates are about is looking at all of the UI and abstracting the things that you can standardize and use everywhere. And that way you don't have all of these sources of truths floating around. So, why use template components? Well, it minimizes manual work. Kind of what I was explaining with that search bar example. If I'm going to make an update here, I want to have one place to make my update. If I ever have to make the same update 20 times, I know that I've missed an opportunity to use components more effectively, to just make it so there's one spot. There should be one spot for every update. That's the way that I kind of use. That's my measuring stick for how I'm using components. Is if I'm doing something manually and it's repetitive, I got to fix that. I gotta figure out how can I use components to speed up my workflow. And then again, standardization. If you have to update everything manually, then you might have 24 pixel padding on the top of one page and 32 pixel padding on the top of the other. And that can either create confusion with engineering. It's like, okay, which one is correct? And if it is missed and you build it the way that it's in Figma, then it's like, well, you don't have a consistent experience for your users. And it makes sense, right? Like, if you have a page with a bunch of consistent layouts in code, you're probably going to have some kind of a wrapper where you're going to put that header and maybe the background color and the top padding in. You're just going to build that one time and then import all of your content into it. And really, template components are just taking that same way of thinking in code and using it in Figma. So, how do you know what to include? I kind of mentioned this already, but you want to look for consistent elements. What is not really changing from page to page? And how can I group pages by which elements are consistent, essentially? So, a pretty standard example, and we'll look at a real version of this, is, maybe you have a sidebar and a header, and then maybe you have like some kind of dynamic content below the header, and then you just have this space where all of the page content is going to live. And my challenge to you is to think through all of those pieces as components, where at each screen level, you're not actually designing everything from scratch. You're just assembling and swapping out different variants and stuff like that. So let's look at a real example. I know I can talk forever, but the most beneficial thing is often just like diving into a real Figma file. So I'm going to look at the core pages files, which just as a reminder is one of these platform pages in here. So we're importing all of our libraries, and then it is a library of itself. So let's go here. Okay, cool. My screen is getting pretty laggy, so hopefully this works. Now, if we look through all of these different pages, you can see how, the content of these pages is obviously changing pretty significantly, but we have a pretty standardized layout. Like this header is staying consistent, this sidebar is staying consistent. We even have these like breadcrumbs and the page heading that's staying consistent. And so right away, we should be saying, okay, that feels like an opportunity to standardize this across all the pages so that we only have to design it once instead of having to make these updates on every single page. And yeah, you have all of these different color overrides. Like this is actually for a platform to prepare for the optometry exam. And so we have these different colors for each classroom. And so like visually things look very, very different, but the fundamental structure, the skeleton of this page is exactly the same. And so we're going to pull that apart and make it a template. And this is how that's going to work. If we look into each one of these frames, you'll see all it is a single component, and it's called core layout. And you can see every single page, even the ones over here with, bookmarks, it's core layout. So where does that take us? If we hit here, it takes us to this page called layouts. And every one of my platform pages here is going to have some layouts associated with that group of pages. And so this file structure is pretty consistent. This is what I use pretty much everywhere. I'll use above the divider line is my actual screens. So as developers, that is the place that that you can come and see the most up-to-date UI that is intended for production and ready to go. Within that, I'll have my layout components, which power all of those screens. And those are comprised of individual components. So I could click on this and go to my sidebar. So you could zoom out here and see like, actually there's quite a bit of components that are happening. And yeah, I'm trying to illustrate the different stages of components. So within an individual file, you have your individual UI components, which you assemble into a layout component, which is pretty simple. It's right here. We have a sidebar, we have a header, and then we have this page content. And within page content, you can see it says, use this to swap out the page type within our core layout. And very easily, I have this list of all the different pages. So maybe I want to look at like past test results, for instance. And you can see that all that does is change that one component. The benefit of this is if I made an update to my sidebar component, or maybe I just wanted to, actually, here's a simple example that we literally did. One day we decided, you know what, we want a little bit more padding on from this content to the sidebar. So maybe I would bump that down 16 pixels. When I do that, every single one of these designs bumped down 16 pixels. And so I've just created this master lever to turn, and it impacts every single page within this file. And that is extremely powerful because like, yeah, maybe it would only taken you 5 minutes to go through and nudge every single one of those elements. But, if you're not using layout components, those little tweaks add up. And all of a sudden, you're spending a good chunk of your day doing these kind of repeatable actions that just shouldn't take so long. And so that is what a layout component does. I'm going to go ahead and fix that. Now, within this layout component, we have the page content. So if I go here, it's directly below. So this layout here of these three components is made up of a page content, which is then another set of components here. And you can see this is what is powering those pages. So now within each page content, I have a single source of truth. So if I want to update the way that these cards look, I only have one spot to do that, and it will reflect everywhere on this page or everywhere in this file. Same thing with review banks and past test results. And all of these are individual components. You can see like this just pulls in an atom of a button from a UI kit. This is a full component. This is a component card. And then I actually take it one more step further, which might be a little bit more specific to this project, but one of these content groups is a classroom. So you can see like this is all of my home pages, but if you click on an individual classroom, it still uses the same layout, but now you have all these different content types. So within my layouts, what I've done is I have classroom content. And classroom content, I can switch between all of these different screens that are being used to power my classroom pages. And I have all of those in another object below it, classroom content. And, I think that some people would look at this and be like, man, you are really over architecting this. Like, we just want to move fast. And actually, the point of building in this way and thinking through the reusability of your UI is to move fast. I don't spend any time nudging things around on a bunch of different pages, or I don't spend any time doing actions twice. I build by creating Legos and bigger Legos and bigger Legos. It goes in. It's that picture of the Russian dolls, right? This right here is the biggest Russian doll. And inside of that is all of these tiers of components that all flow down from each other. And so I have along every part of my UI, I have all these little knobs that I can turn. And each knob, I only have to turn once, and it impacts every single part of the UI that is actually using that component or using that element. And so when I get to the core pages, and I think this is kind of reflective of how you would build something in React even. When I get to this core pages, I'm not creating anything from scratch. All I am doing is just assembling the components that I've built up and just plugging them into my UI so that I can move really, really fast. Okay, I'm going to stop there at that point. Pretty much wrapping up here, and then we can get to some questions. Yeah, landing the plane. Okay. The core takeaway is I hope this walkthrough gave you a little bit more ammunition to really understand like what the true benefit of creating this shared language between design and engineering really is, and how we can think through things atomically and use components to speed up our workflow, stay on the same page. And I've kind of broken that up into four main buckets of benefits. One is it's just more efficient. You don't do things twice. It minimizes manual work. It makes it easier to talk about your designs too. Like it gives you very specific words that both engineering has in the code base and Figma has in a UI kit or in a page file. And when I say classroom card, the developers immediately know what that is. They don't even have to think about it. I could just say put 3 classroom cards here, and the UI would automatically be the same as it would be in Figma because we've created this language. We have a level of understanding and standardization. And that kind of already, I touched on that last point, I guess already, which is it feels like assembling Legos. If you're just plugging in Legos to build these complex UIs, you're doing things well, and you're going to make it really easy to make these sweeping changes across the product in a way that just doesn't take that much time. And then another big benefit is it's just more standardized, which obviously drives some of the efficiency, but it also makes it a better UI UX, which is kind of this third bucket here. Because as users, we're really driving familiarity with your product. Like we know what a button looks like. We even know where a button typically is. We understand how the interaction models work with a product when everything is consistent. It just makes it minimizes the time that users have to figure out how a product works at a high level. And then also we can ship features faster when we're not rebuilding things that are only a little bit different, and we're really just assembling Legos. We can ship more meaningful features in a shorter amount of time. And then the last thing is it's a lot easier to explore and prototype ideas when we have our like design language. We can test ideas really quickly because we have all these pre-built components that we can assemble in new ways. Or maybe we just say, we have this sidebar, we want to explore adding these features, and I can really quickly import my most up-to-date sidebar, detach it, work on it, make the changes, and publish it back to the team library. So I know that was a mouthful, but those are some of the core benefits that I see. And really there are kind of four main areas of the product that you can use to drive this design language and really improve the way that we're sharing mental models from design and engineering. Because at the end of the day, Figma is nothing more than a representation of the product. It's not a product. It's a representation. And as designers, it's our job to make sure that that representation is as effective, as communicative, as robust as possible, because we want to make the lives of engineers easier, really. I mean, that's like one of the main jobs of designers. And so the four kind of areas that we can think about that is one, like creating parity at the component level, thinking through things atomically. And then we have our design tokens, making sure that we have the same words. And I fully believe that every team should have a style guide that like to the letter matches the theme file in your code base. And then thinking through things in template layouts. Developers are probably already doing this. Designers can benefit from the exact same frameworks of thinking through reusability, even at the page structure level, and making sure that we're not doing unnecessary things twice. And then the last level is libraries. How can we drive parity at an organizational level so that the high level structure of the code base matches the high level structure of Figma, and everyone can get on the same page much more easily? I'm going to call it quits there, and we can kind of go into some questions. If there are any questions, we can explore other things as well. But I'm going to turn it back to you guys.
Thank you, Reed, for the highly amazing and immersive talk. I would rather call it an experience than a talk. And we can only imagine the kind of efforts and hours it would have taken to create the presentation that you have, to collect all the information and add the visually intuitive UI elements. It's just a testimonial of your creative and artistic brain. I hope everyone has enjoyed it as much as I have. So I can see a couple of questions already up, but before that, if we could take a few steps back, and I'm just curious. I want to know, like, what inspired you to create Figma? Like, there are so many vector graphics editor out there in the market, and Figma is primarily web-based, so that's one of the primary differences. So, what exactly was the inspiration, and where did you feel that the need to create a vector editor of your own?
Yeah, so I actually, if I go back 2 jobs ago, I was working at an agency, and I was the reason that the agency didn't switch from Sketch to Figma. Like I just refused to let go of Sketch and the different tooling and the way that worked. And so I don't know, I was actually a late adopter, relatively speaking, but I love Figma primarily because it is web-based. It just having it be an inherently collaborative software is really what makes, like, everything that I talked about in this presentation, it's what makes it possible. And it's so much easier to get on the same page with developers, to over communicate, especially when everyone, we're working remotely. Most products get built remotely right now. That becomes even more important to over communicate and make asynchronous collaboration possible. And the way that Figma has built their product, it actually has created a different mental model for me, where I don't even really think about a page as just I just need to slap all of my UI mockups on here. The page is like this interactive experience where I can add little notes and talk about different prototypes and link between pages and create these brain maps of how the organization as a whole operates. And so I think that Figma has taken design tooling and kind of to an extent made everyone a designer, which I think is really powerful.
Thank you, Red, for that. So we have got a couple of questions, and I'll read it out one by one. So the first one is by Vardhan Kale, and the question is, what needs to be done to reimagine the better version of an existing product? At this moment, I know that I don't like what I see, but I'm unable to reimagine the better version.
Yeah. That's something that actually has come up a lot recently in Shift Nudge, different students talking about that because they're learning a lot of visual ideas and best practices that you want to apply to a product, but not everyone gets to take these ideas and start on a blank piece of paper and like build from the ground up, right? And I think that it is important to take things in chunks. If it's so easy to have this mindset of like, well, that's going to be the next version, we'll put that in the next version. And what happens is the next version becomes so bloated and so massive that it doesn't actually really happen. And so I like to draw a line in the product, and I'll actually sometimes create a separate UI kit file even where I have everything that was all of the pre-existing layouts and components. And then one by one, as I'm creating new components, I'll introduce some like subtle improvements to the style, for instance. And that way it is more of a process. Like most teams don't have the luxury of like, we're going to redesign the whole thing. It is more about incremental improvement. And my encouragement though would be, even though things will be rolled out incrementally, as designers, it's important to honestly take some time and write out what are the stylistic foundations that I want this next version of the product to embody. Like, how do I want that to look? And even though I'm rolling things out in small chunks and just making subtle improvements over here, I want to make sure that those subtle improvements are contributing towards my like end vision of what I want the product to look like. And honestly, you asked, how do you even go from I know this feels off to like a better version of the product? It's not always easy, but I highly, highly encourage you to really spend the time finding inspiration. I create so many mood boards in Figma, it's ridiculous. Like if I want to start off, say I'm creating a new SaaS application, like I will find 25 different products and little snippets of ideas that I like, and I will throw them all into a single Figma page, and then I will try to extract some consistencies and like turn it into kind of like essentially still a mood board, but like specific to my product, where I'm like, I really like the way that they thought about border radiuses over here, and I really like the way that the modals look and feel in this product. And if I combined that with the color palette and typography of this brand I really like and tweak the colors a little bit, now I can pull from these different sources of inspiration, create really like a style guide or a mood board of where I want the product to be eventually. And then you just find incremental little improvements. Like every time maybe you're working on a section of the product or shipping a new feature, make sure that the styles that you're using are tied back to that like end goal mood board or style guide or whatever you want to call it.
Thank you, Reid. So next up, we have this question by Techno Vibes. What should be a proper format to maintain all the elements of a project inside Figma?
Yeah, that's a good question. Am I still sharing my screen?
No, you're not.
Okay, let me put my screen back up here. Probably be easiest to just point to it. So there are definitely different ways that you can think about this. But what I typically like to do is I'll think through things in flows, really, where I will maybe I'll document like I guess. Oh, let me back up. I will go top to bottom and left to right. Left to right is one flow, and maybe it's just showing an individual user journey or the states within a certain layout. And then from top to bottom will basically just be my flows stacked on top of each other. And one of those, as you can see here, it might not necessarily be a flow, and it might just be, hey, here's how this layout responds at different breakpoints. And this is a pretty consistent format that I will follow, where I'll use components. I call them handoff helpers. In fact, if you Google handoff helpers, I have a really robust component library that will give you access to this kind of documentation here, where you can say like, okay, here's the sidebar states. They are green check, so developers know they're ready to go. This is the title that spans the entire flow, so you can follow it left to right and really quickly like group flows and give it a name. And then you can also like I add a lot of little notes where I'll this is a quick little note about truncation, and hey, can we truncate the chapter name at 2 lines, for instance. So this is, there's obviously some changes from file to file, but the high level mental model is I will go left to right will be an individual flow and documenting all the states within that flow. And top to bottom will be all of the flows stacked on top of each other. And a lot of times, if there's subtle differences, like actually, let me go back here. So you can see here, like if there are subtle differences between screens, and maybe I just want to indicate like this is the empty state for something, I'll stack those vertically. So you can see it's like we have, this one's a pretty simple file. We really just have one flow and then the classrooms, which technically I guess I could put the classrooms down here. I don't think that matters a ton, but we move left to right through all of the different pages or how to flow through this part of the dashboard. And then within that flow, I will move top to bottom to indicate the different states of that flow. So hopefully that helps and makes a little bit of sense.
We have a few requests from Kamesh, Akash, and Satish. So if you could share your screen again, they want you to demo related to interactive components. So if you could show something related to switchable state interaction, it would be really helpful.
Let's do it. Well, they always say never design live, right? But no, this is great. I actually wanted to do this. Okay, let's do buttons because that's going to be the most easy. And here's a mistake that I see people, especially students, making a lot is like they'll say, I want a button. So I'm going to draw a rectangle and then I'm going to put text on top of the rectangle. And the reason that doesn't work is you can't use auto layout. And honestly, auto layout is so incredibly important right now for designers. And oh, look at that. They added a feature where I can turn it into auto layout and it actually gets rid of the rectangle. So you can see like I didn't need that rectangle at all. But let's make a button really quickly. And my button is going to be, I'm going to add a little arrow here. Cool. Let's add 32 pixels. Make this bigger. It's going to be a huge button, I guess. Okay, and so now I have this frame, and here you can see it's set to packed. I want to align these to the center, and I'm gonna a little more breathing room in between these elements, so I'm gonna bump that up to like 24 pixels. Okay, cool. I like soft rounded things, so I'm gonna make this a pill, and then I have my color libraries here, and I will make that purple. Okay, let's add a little bit more padding on the sides, maybe a little bit more on the top. Now, buttons have a ton of different states, right? Um, you might have a different size. You probably have some kind of a different state, which is like an active, disabled, hover, or something like that. And then you might have different button types. So maybe one's an outline and one's a fill, for instance. Now, for our purposes, what I'm going to do is I'll keep this kind of simple because you can take forever creating 100 different buttons, but I'm going to create a component from this auto layout button, and I'm going to make sure to name this base. And the idea of this button is, and actually, I'll add another arrow over here because I don't know, it might be a back button in the future. So I want to have the option to have an icon on either side of the text. And the idea behind this base component is the most complex version of the button. That's what we want to create. And then we customize it with overrides. So if I duplicate this, if I take this and duplicate it, I have an instance of the base component. I'm actually going to create a component from this, and I'll just call it default for now. And so now, obviously, if I make a change to my base component here, that's going to reflect here. And I'm going to do that one more time. And then, maybe we'll make this like a disabled. All right. So obviously, in real life, I don't want icons on both sides of my buttons. So I'm going to just focus on the left, and I'll call this one disabled. Now, once I have at least 2 instances of my base button that I can turn into components, then I can combine these as variants by hitting that button right there. And I'll name the whole component button. So now I like to think through, even before like creating all of the different buttons, I like to think through the different properties that I'm going to have. So I'll make this kind of a simple example because I don't want to spend 20 minutes making buttons. This is just the, we'll go state, default, disabled, and I'll add one more. I'm actually going to make this an auto layout so that it automatically resizes. I'm going to add one more, and we'll make it hover. And maybe on hover, I don't know, maybe it lightens color like that. So now the important thing is all of these buttons, all inside of it, are tied back to my base button. So that is, call this hover. That is wonderful because remember, we don't want to make ourselves do things twice. We want to make it very standardized and easy. So if I insert a button here, maybe I'll change the text to click me. And maybe I'll even change the, actually, let's do this. Go back because I want to change the icon too. Okay, cool. Now, what happens is if you don't use a base component, you run into one of two issues. If all of these are their individual instances and you don't have any nested components, if you want to make a change, you have to like change the padding at every single level. So if you have 20 buttons, you have to change the padding 20 times. Similarly, if you derive these components from the original variant, so like if my first step was to create a new variant from this original one, your overrides don't stay. So if I would change, go back, what would happen is when I changed this to disabled, the text would change and the icon would go back to the right. So that's why it's important to put this first component here, because you have all of the benefits of a single source of truth. I can make these way wider, but your overrides stay. So now let's say, let's just make this the interactive component. Let's do left. I know this is kind of a silly example, but. And for interactive components, all I have to do is add a new prototype interaction, and I want to make sure it's set to change to. And I can, I could add a smart animate if I want it. It wouldn't be as relevant here. And then same thing over here. Change to. Okay, so now anytime at a component level that I switch between these buttons, it's automatically going to swap components. And the really nice thing then is, let's say I have a much larger layout here, okay. And I want to add a button to that layout. Oh, baby, those buttons are big. Now, let's make sure. Okay, cool. If I go into prototype mode, which this hopefully will load quickly. All right, let's head over to our button. Probably should have done this on a different page. There it is. Okay, now I can click this button and it's automatically going to switch between those two components. And the nice thing is, man, you talk about streamlining the way that you're thinking through layouts. If you have interactive components set up, you don't have to create all of these different screens to simulate how a button goes from one instance to the next. And you can build out these variants where let's look at this, for instance. I could actually set up, and in fact, I built these screens before interactive components was available. So I would love to do this, but I could set it up where this here was a component. And if I clicked on an individual answer, that actually triggered this state over here, where all of this stuff automatically appeared, and I could do it all on one frame instead of having to use like 8 frames to indicate how this interaction actually works. So it's just another way that Figma is making it super easy to streamline workflows, again, minimize sources of truth, and just make it so you don't have to do a ton of repetitive work. Okay, hopefully that gave you some practical takeaways in terms of specifically how to. I can't stress the importance of this base component enough. It really is the game changer, especially when you're going to level that up into interactive components. Having everything tied back to that single source of truth is going to be really helpful. I'll leave that question there.
Thank you, Rick, for the quick demo. It certainly helped to have a quicker, closer look at the interactive components. So we've got a couple of more questions, and we'll take Ankit's question first. So Ankit is asking, are there any trade-offs or limitations that you can talk about related to auto layout? Sometimes he feels a little weird designing with auto layout, especially when they're nested.
Yeah, totally. There used to be a lot more trade-offs, actually. Figma just, kind of recently released the next version of auto layout where you actually can set something to space between. Let me find a more complex card really quickly to talk about. Okay. So this is a good example. Before, there actually was some pretty clear frustrations where if I wanted something to be like this with one element pinned to the left and one element pinned to the right, I wouldn't have been able to use auto layout because I couldn't resize my card as a result of like this having to be a fixed width. But actually, man, with the new release, the Auto 2.0, I almost never find myself in a situation where auto layout makes it so I can't build something. And the more familiar I get with auto layout, the faster I can create things. And so honestly, like my high level, and you can kind of see how this would respond. This used to not be possible, but now it is quite possible, and you can move really fast with it. My high level advice, honestly, would be to just keep doing it. Keep doing it. The more familiar you are with auto layout, I promise the better designer you're going to be. 2 kind of practical ways that I navigate auto layout. One is if you're not already using Enter and Shift Enter to navigate your layer list, do it. It's the game changer with auto layout because like HTML, you're probably going to have a bunch of divs wrapped inside of each other, the same way that we have to create things with auto layout. So to enter into this component, I just hit Enter. You can see now I'm in card content. Hit Enter again. I'm in instructor. And I'm just doing this with my keyboard, enter and shift enter. Shift enter moves me back up. That is this year, even I forced myself. I said, I'm going to navigate the layer list with enter and shift enter. And it has made me so much faster. I highly recommend just training yourself. And then the other thing is, a lot of times, let's go into layouts here. A lot of times when we have these auto layout sections here, and you can see like this whole thing is an auto layout where we have page content, I have my items and my overview component. Now let's say I want to drag something new in. How many times are you in a situation where you're dragging something onto a canvas and there's a bunch of auto layout? Oh, geez, didn't copy. There's a bunch of auto layouts and you really just want something to be fixed, like, or absolutely positioned, and it's breaking your whole design. The way that just a little thing you can do to make that easier is if you use spacebar, you can see I'm dragging over this auto layout, but it's not forcing me to drop it into the auto layout, and I could put it somewhere on top. So spacebar is really, really helpful when you're just arranging things with auto layout. As a whole, though, again, I'll say it one more time, like everything on every single screen is just full of a ton of auto layouts, and I think it's going to make you a more efficient designer. It's going to make your UI more communicative to our developers, because that's how they're going to ultimately build it. And a lot of the benefits of driving towards parity between code and design are really only possible through auto layout. So I encourage you to keep with it.
Thank you, Reed. So we have got one more request by Akash. If you could quickly show a demo of the variants feature, that is his request, variants feature of Figma.
Yeah, so that was actually what I was showing in core pages here with the buttons. But I'll share a little bit more of a complex one, just to kind of show what it's possible, what it's capable of. So over here, I have a sidebar, right? And if I head to this component, the sidebar is actually made up of components. So if I drill into this here, I have my scroll track, which has a question list, and these are individual list questions, or what do I call them? Yeah, list questions here. And then if I drill out of that, I also have a header with, I have my input or my select here. I have little icons that are also components, and then my icon buttons as well. So there's a lot going on in this, and I have different variants as well. So if I'm going to insert a sidebar to the side so we can play with it. You can see there's a bunch of nested variants. At a high level, I have my different sidebars where I can say, is the state start or review? And is it a list or a grid? Like that. Okay. And the way that I am able to do that is I have nested variants within. So within that, I have my view tabs, which you'll notice here, there's two of these because I'm using the base component and then populating it in here. And then the same way, I have my grid view items as well, where I have my base component and then the individual grid question, where maybe I would say, actually, I want this to be bigger. And that's going to update every single one of those. Okay. And then one more is I have the list items as well, and they're built in the exact same way. So all of those nested variants, I'm just inserting them as components into here. And what that allows me to do then is this thing is so functional. I already showed how I can switch between like the list and the grid, which by the way, could be an interactive component now. Like I could have this toggle be an interactive component and actually switch the whole sidebar back between list and grid. And that way, anytime I insert that component on any screen, I can dynamically update the sidebar instead of having to create a bunch of new screens for it. Okay. And if I drill into this sidebar, this is where I can I can actually like really start playing with stuff. And I actually, in an old version of this, we used to be able to hide this filter. So I had another variant, and all it was just the version of this sidebar where I hid this select right here. So this is a little bit more of a complex example. And all I did was, you can see it's just 4 versions. It's the 2 versions of the list and the 2 versions of the grid. And one has like active responses and the other one doesn't. And so by defining those one time at the component level called sidebar, and you can see here I have my properties, state and view, then that's what allows me to insert that component and just really quickly change between things. So yeah, hopefully that gives it a little bit better picture of a more complex variant and how you can actually nest variants within. Because at any time, I could click on number 7 and I could change number 7 to hover or something like that.
Thank you so much, Reid. So can we go ahead with one more question?
Sure.
Okay, so we have got one last question by Vardhan, and Vardhan is asking, he's saying he has 0 experience in Figma, and he wonders if you have a step-by-step guide or any resource on how he can achieve what you have taught today by creating a project.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't personally have the full step-by-step guide. I'm in the process of building a little bit more of a curriculum, but the 2 best things for someone that's really just starting out are, 1, Figma actually has a really good introductory YouTube channel. I would devour every YouTube video that they have because it starts from ground zero basically and really walks you through there's a level of familiarity that you almost have to have that honestly I kind of skipped over in this presentation. Like some of the concepts were a little bit more advanced in terms of how we're like thinking about complex components. Definitely start with the Figma YouTube. And then the other thing, and maybe this is just me, but actually I think one of the best ways to learn how to create in Figma is to actually, if you go into the Figma community and search design system, they have a lot of open source design systems from like really recognizable companies like Uber and Microsoft have theirs, for instance. And I highly recommend you clicking around in those design systems, breaking it apart, moving things around, and that'll teach you how these like fundamental Legos are put together. And it's no better way to really learn the building blocks of Figma than just throwing yourself in the deep end of one of these design systems. And there are a lot of really awesome resources in the community as well.
All right, so I guess we're done with all the questions. Thank you so much, Reid, for the wonderful presentation, for everything that you've put up. It was indeed a visual treat. We all have enjoyed it, and there are lots of cues to take up, lots of things to follow up from here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Reid. Bye. All right, folks.